we think we know the Second World War. Okay? We see the images, the beaches of Normandy, the snows of Stalingrad, the skies over London. But what if that's only a fraction of the story? The war was fought in nearly every country on Earth. It was fought in places we never imagine. On Arctic islands and in tropical jungles. In deserts and in dense European forests. Did you know American and Japanese soldiers fought a brutal campaign in Alaska? Or that British and French troops fought each other in the Middle East? Or that for a time the fate of the war in the Indian Ocean hinged on the island of Madagascar? The war had more fronts than we remember. More campaigns, more stories. These are the forgotten ones. The sideshows that were life or death for the people involved, the strange conflicts that don't fit the simple narrative. The operations that were crucial but are now just footnotes. We know the big battles, but the war was won and lost in these other places too. In the mud of Burma, in the fjords of Norway, in the mountains of Ethiopia, this is a look at those other wars. The ones that have been pushed to the margins of history, the ones that show just how global and how strange the conflict really was. Number 17, what if France fought Britain? It happened. In 1941, the war came to the Levant. The territories of modern-day Syria and Lebanon were controlled by Vichy France. This was the French government that had made a deal with the German regime, and the Allies were worried. They feared that airfields in Syria and Lebanon could be used by German aircraft. These planes could threaten the Suez Canal and oil fields in Iraq. It was a serious risk. So in June 1941, they launched an invasion. It was called Operation Exporter. What made this campaign so strange was who was fighting. On one side were British, Australian, Indian, and Free French forces. The Free French were led by Charles de Gaulle. They had refused to surrender and continued the fight. On the other side were the Vichy French forces. These were French soldiers loyal to the government in Vichy. So Frenchmen were fighting Frenchmen. It was a bitter personal conflict. The fighting was tough. The Vichy forces were well trained and knew the terrain. They had tanks and aircraft. The campaign lasted for over a month. The Allies advanced from Palestine and Iraq. There were battles for Damascus and Beirut. The fighting was intense, but it's rarely shown in movies or documentaries. A key figure was the British General Henry Maitland Wilson. He commanded the Allied force. He had to balance military objectives with the tricky political situation. He was fighting an official government, not a rebel group. The campaign is detailed in books like Major General the 1SO Playfair's Official History, the Mediterranean and Middle East. He documents the day-to-day struggles. The Allies had about 34,000 troops. The Vichy French had about 35,000. It was an even match. In the end, the Allies prevailed. An armistice was signed on July 14th, 1941. The Allies took control of Syria and Lebanon. It secured the Middle Eastern flank, but it came at a cost. The Free French saw the Vichy soldiers as traitors. The Vichy soldiers saw the Free French as rebels fighting their own country. The wounds were deep. The campaign highlights the complicated loyalties of the war. It wasn't always a clear case of good guys versus bad guys. Sometimes it was countrymen against countrymen. The war split nations, families, and friends. The Syria-Lebanon campaign is a stark example of this. It was a necessary fight for the Allies, but a tragic one for France. It remains a largely forgotten chapter. What do we still not know? How many Vichy French soldiers secretly sympathized with the Allies, but fought out of a sense of duty? What long-term impact did this French versus French conflict have on the post-war French military? And were there secret negotiations happening behind the scenes that we are still unaware of? Number 16, could a tiny island in the North Atlantic change the war? In 1940, Iceland was a sovereign kingdom. It had a personal union with Denmark. When German forces occupied Denmark in April 1940, the British government grew concerned. Well, Iceland's location was critical. It sat right in the middle of the Gjögr Gap. That's the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. If German U-boats or warships used Iceland as a base, they could dominate the North Atlantic. They could sever the supply lines from North America to Britain. For Britain, this was an existential threat. The government in London could not let that happen, so they acted. On May 10th, 1940, British forces landed in Reykjavik. The operation was codenamed Operation Fork. It was a strange invasion. There was no fighting. Iceland had no army. The local police tried to protest, but they were no match for 700 Royal Marines. The Icelandic government issued a formal protest but told its citizens to treat the British troops as guests. The occupation was mostly peaceful. The British promised to leave after the war and to respect Icelandic sovereignty. They built roads, hospitals, and airfields. This construction boom was called Blessed War by some locals because it brought jobs and money. The occupation force grew. Eventually, there were 25,000 British troops on an island with a population of only 120,000. And then in 1941, the situation changed again. The United States was not yet in the war, but President Franklin D. Roosevelt was looking for ways to help Britain. He agreed to take over the defense of Iceland. This freed up British troops for other fronts. On July 7th, 1941, American Marines landed in Iceland. This was 5 months before Pearl Harbor. It was a significant step for a country that was officially neutral. Historian Donald E. Nutherline explores this in his work, Iceland, Reluctant Ally. He shows how Iceland was pulled into the global conflict against its will. The American presence grew even larger. By the middle of the war, there were over 40,000 American military personnel in Iceland. They built a massive airbase at Keflavik, which would remain a key NATO base for decades. The occupation transformed Icelandic society. It brought the modern world to a small, isolated nation, but it also brought social tensions. The relationship between soldiers and local women was a source of friction. The impact of this friendly occupation is still debated in Iceland today, but strategically it was a clear success for the Allies. They secured the North Atlantic. They denied a crucial base to the enemy. It was an invasion without a battle, a campaign without combat, but one that was vital to the war effort. But what secret communications passed between Reykjavik and Berlin before the British invasion? How close did the German regime come to launching its own invasion of Iceland, an operation they codenamed Operation Icarus? And what long-term cultural price did Iceland pay for the economic boom the occupation brought? Number 15, why did a war for the world come to a frozen, foggy island chain? Now, most people think the Second World War never touched American soil. They think of Pearl Harbor, an attack on a territory. But the war did come to America. It came to Alaska, to a string of volcanic islands called the Aleutians. This campaign is often called the Forgotten Battle or the 1,000-Mile War. It was fought in some of the worst weather conditions on the planet. The enemy here wasn't just the Japanese forces, it was the fog, the wind, and the cold. In June 1942, Japanese forces launched an attack on the Aleutians. They bombed Dutch Harbor, a U.S. naval base. Then they occupied two islands, Attu and Kiska. This was the first time American territory had been occupied by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. The Japanese had two main goals. First, it was a diversion. The main Japanese fleet was heading for Midway Atoll. They hoped the attack on the Aleutians would draw part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet north. Second, the islands could serve as a defensive buffer. They could block any potential American advance on Japan from the north. The American public was shocked. The idea of enemy troops on U.S. soil was terrifying. The U.S. military had to respond, but it was incredibly difficult. The Aleutians are known for their terrible weather. The islands are shrouded in thick fog for much of the year. They are hit by violent winds called willywaws, which can reach speeds of over 100 miles per hour. Flying was treacherous. Sailing was dangerous. Just surviving was a challenge. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and trench foot. Equipment broke down in the extreme cold. The fight to retake the islands was long and hard. For nearly a year, American and Canadian air forces bombed the Japanese positions on Kiska and Attu. In May 1943, U.S. forces launched an invasion to retake Attu. The battle was brutal. The Japanese defenders were dug in and fought fiercely. The American troops were not prepared for the Arctic conditions. In his book, The 1,000-Mile War, Brian Garfield provides a gripping account of the campaign. He describes the misery and the courage of the soldiers on both sides. After 19 days of fighting, Attu was back in American hands. The cost was high. For the number of troops involved, it was one of the costliest battles in the Pacific theater. Next was Kiska. The Allies planned a massive invasion for August 1943. Nearly 35,000 American and Canadian troops landed on the island. But they found something strange. The island was empty. Under the cover of the dense Aleutian fog, the the Japanese Navy had secretly evacuated their entire garrison of over 5,000 men. The Allies had been bombing and shelling an abandoned island. The Aleutian campaign was over. It was a sideshow to the main events in the Pacific. But it tied up valuable resources and cost thousands of lives. It was a war fought at the edge of the world, a war against both man and nature. What was the true strategic value of the islands in the age of long-range bombers? Did the campaign justify the cost in lives and resources for both sides? And what classified records might still exist that could reveal different hidden motivations for the initial Japanese invasion? Number 14, how did an army defeat itself before the enemy arrived? This is the story of the Slovak National Uprising. It's a story of courage, betrayal, and bad timing. In late 1944, the war on the Eastern Front was moving west. The Soviet Red Army was pushing the German forces back. Slovakia was at the time a client state of the German regime, but within the Slovak army and government, there was a growing resistance movement. They planned to rise up against the government and switch sides to join the Allies. The plan was coordinated with the Soviets. The Slovak army would secure the mountain passes in the Carpathians. This would allow the Red Army to sweep into Slovakia quickly. It was a good plan. The uprising was planned for a specific time, but it was triggered too early. Partisan activity in Slovakia was increasing. In response, German troops began to enter the country to restore order. This forced the rebels' hand. On August 29, 1944, the uprising began. The rebel forces consisted of about 60,000 Slovak soldiers and 18,000 partisans. They seized control of a large territory in central Slovakia with the city of Banská Bystrica as their capital. They had tanks, artillery, and even their own air force. For a brief moment, liberated Czechoslovakia existed in the heart of Axis-controlled Europe, but things went wrong. The timing was off. The Red Army was not ready to advance through the passes. They were engaged in heavy fighting elsewhere. The rebels had expected the entire Slovak army to join them, but the best equipped divisions in eastern Slovakia did not. Their commanders hesitated, and German forces quickly disarmed them. The rebels were isolated. They were surrounded by superior German forces. They had hoped for significant Allied help. The Americans and British did fly in some supplies. Soviet aid was also limited. The rebels were on their own. A key figure was General John Golian, the commander of the rebel army. He was a brave but tragic figure. He had to lead an under-equipped army against a powerful enemy with little outside help. The German response was swift and brutal. They launched a major counter-offensive. The rebels fought hard for 2 months. They defended the mountains and valleys of central Slovakia. But they couldn't hold out forever. In late October 1944, Banská Bystrica fell. The uprising was crushed. The remaining soldiers and partisans retreated into the mountains to wage a guerrilla war through the harsh winter. The uprising is a controversial topic for historians. Some, like the scholar Yeshayahu Jelinek, have written about the complex internal politics that hampered the rebellion. It was a military failure. It did not achieve its main objective of linking up with the Red Army, but it was not a complete failure. It tied down thousands of German troops who were needed on other fronts. It showed the world that Slovaks were not just passive collaborators. They were willing to fight for their freedom. It remains a powerful symbol of national resistance, a heroic but doomed effort. Why did the commanders of the Eastern Slovak divisions fail to join the uprising? Was it incompetence, betrayal, or a calculated decision? How much more aid could the Western Allies and the Soviets have provided, and would it have made a difference? And what if the uprising had succeeded in opening the Carpathian passes? How would that have changed the timeline for the end of the war in Central Europe? Number 13, could a naval battle in South America signal the future of the war? The war was only a few months old. It was December 1939. Much of the world was still in a state of phony war. But in the South Atlantic, off the coast of Uruguay, one of the first major naval battles of the conflict took place. It was a dramatic chase that captured the world's attention. The star of the show was a German pocket battleship, the Admiral Graf Spee. It was one of the most advanced warships of its time. It was faster than the ships that were stronger and stronger than the ships that were faster. Its mission was to raid Allied merchant shipping in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and it was very good at its job. The Graf Spee, under the command of Captain Hans Langsdorff, had been a ghost. For weeks, it sank ship after ship, disrupting trade and causing panic at the British Admiralty. Langsdorff was a skilled and humane captain. He took the crews of the sunken ships on board as prisoners, and he treated them well. But the Royal Navy was hunting him. Several hunting groups were scouring the oceans. The one that found him was Force G, commanded by Commodore Henry Harwood. It consisted of 3 cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles. On paper, the Graf Spee outgunned them all. Its 11-inch guns were far superior to the 8-inch and 6-inch guns of the British cruisers. On the morning of December 13th, 1939, they met. The Battle of the River Plate began. Harwood had a clever plan. He split his force to divide the Graf Spee's fire. The battle was fierce. The Exeter was badly damaged and forced to withdraw. The Ajax and Achilles also took hits. But they landed blows on the Graf Spee as well. The German ship was not heavily armored. The British shells damaged its fuel systems and its desalination plant, which was crucial for its engines. After a little over an hour of intense fighting, Langsdorff made a fateful decision. He broke off the fight and headed for the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay. This is where the battle turned into a tense diplomatic drama. Under international law, a warship could only stay in a neutral port for a limited time. The British, led by diplomat Eugene Millington Drake, used every trick they could to convince the Uruguayans and Langsdorff that a huge British fleet was waiting just outside the harbor. They fed false intelligence and arranged for British and French merchant ships to sail out of the port at regular intervals, which, under the rules of war, extended the time the Graf Spee had to stay. Langsdorff was trapped, his ship was damaged, he was led to believe he faced an overwhelming force. He did not want to sacrifice his crew in a hopeless battle. On December 17th, he sailed the Graf Spee just outside the harbor and scuttled it. The crew watched from another boat as their magnificent ship settled into the mud of the River Plate. A few days later, Captain Langsdorff, a man of the old naval tradition, took his own life. The Battle of the River Plate was a huge propaganda victory for the British. It was a story of David versus Goliath. It showed that the German surface fleet could be beaten. Dudley Pope's book, The Battle of the River Plate, is a classic account of this cat-and-mouse game. The battle was a glimpse of the long, hard naval war to come. But was the Graf Spee as badly damaged as Langsdorff believed? Could he have fought his way out and reached a friendly port? And what if he had chosen to fight? Could he have destroyed the remaining British cruisers, even at the cost of his own ship, changing the early narrative of the naval war? Number 12, how do you fight a war when the mud is the real enemy? This campaign has been called the Forgotten War. The soldiers who fought there called themselves the Forgotten Army. It was the Burma campaign, fought from 1942 to 1945. It was one of the longest and most brutal campaigns of the entire war. You know, the terrain was some of the most difficult in the world. Dense jungle, towering mountains, raging rivers. And during the monsoon season, there was the mud. The mud was everywhere. It swallowed men, machines, and supplies. On top of that, there were diseases, malaria, dysentery, typhus. For many soldiers, the environment was a more dangerous enemy than the Japanese. The campaign began with a disaster. In early 1942, Japanese forces invaded Burma, which was then a British colony. They quickly outmaneuvered the British and Commonwealth forces. What followed was the longest retreat in British military history. The army, along with thousands of civilian refugees, made a grueling trek of hundreds of miles through the jungle to the safety of India. The conditions were horrific. The retreat from Burma is a story of incredible suffering and endurance. For the next 2 years, the front in Burma was a stalemate. The Allies tried to launch counteroffensives, but they failed. The logistics were a nightmare. Building roads through the jungle was almost impossible. Everything had to be brought in by air. The Japanese forces were masters of jungle warfare. They were tough and disciplined. But then the tide began to turn. The Allies got a new commander, General William Slim. Slim is now considered one of the greatest generals of the war. He was a brilliant strategist and a charismatic leader. His men loved him because he understood their struggles. He focused on 3 things: improving supply lines, tackling disease, and training his men for jungle warfare. Slim transformed the 14th Army. It was a truly multinational force. It included British, Indian, African, and Chinese soldiers. He used new tactics. He relied heavily on air power to supply his troops. This meant his units could be cut off by the Japanese, but still fight on. They were no longer tied to roads. This was revolutionary. The turning point came in 1944 with the battles of Imphal and Kohima. The Japanese launched a major offensive to invade India. The fighting was some of the most savage of the war. At Kohima, a small garrison held out against a much larger Japanese force. The fighting was so close it was called the Battle of the Tennis Court. The Allied forces held. The Japanese offensive was defeated. It was a catastrophic loss for them. After Imphal and Kohima, the tide had turned for good. Islam's 14th Army began the long, hard fight to reconquer Burma. They crossed the Chindwin and Irrawaddy rivers. They retook Mandalay. And finally, in May 1945, Rangoon. The campaign is vividly described in Slim's own memoir, Defeat into Victory. It is a classic of military literature. The Burma campaign was a sideshow compared to the war in Europe, but it was vital. It protected India and was a key part of the war against Japan. It was a victory won not just against a determined enemy, but against the jungle itself. But what if Slim had not been appointed commander? Could another general have turned the tide in Burma? How critical was the role of the special forces units, like the Chindits, who operated deep behind enemy lines? And to what extent did the campaign rely on the often uncredited contributions of local Burmese Kachin and Karen fighters who sided with the Allies? You're number 11, who fought a war after their war was over. Finland's story in the Second World War is complex. It fought 3 distinct wars. First was the Winter War against the Soviet Union in 1939 to 40. Then came the Continuation War, from 1941 to 1944, where Finland fought alongside the German forces against the Soviets. But it's the third war that is the most forgotten and perhaps the strangest. It was called the Lapland War. And in this war, Finland fought against its former German allies. In September 1944, Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. The terms were harsh. Finland had to give up territory and pay reparations, but one condition was particularly difficult. And Finland had to expel all German troops from its territory. There were about 200,000 German soldiers in northern Finland in the region of Lapland. They had been fighting the Soviets on the northernmost part of the Eastern Front. They were part of Operation Silver Fox, the attempt to capture the Soviet port of Murmansk. Now, their Finnish hosts were told to kick them out. At first, both the Finns and the Germans tried to make the withdrawal peaceful. There was a secret agreement. The Germans would retreat into Norway, which was also occupied by German forces. The Finns would attack them in a theatrical way, just enough to show the Soviets they were fulfilling the terms of the armistice. There were strange scenes of Finns giving the retreating German supplies and helping them destroy roads to slow down any potential Soviet advance. This phony war phase is documented in works like Finland at War by Väisänenjä, but the Soviets saw through this. They put pressure on the Finns to take more aggressive action. The war turned real. The Finnish army, now technically on the side of the Allies, began to seriously attack the retreating German forces. The German commander, General Lothar Rendulic, was furious. In retaliation, he ordered a scorched earth policy. As the German forces retreated through Lapland, they destroyed everything in their path. They burned down towns and villages. They destroyed bridges, roads, and railways. The city of Rovaniemi, the capital of Lapland, was almost completely wiped out. It was an act of brutal, vindictive destruction. The Lapland War was fought in the harsh Arctic wilderness. The fighting was sporadic but intense. The Finns were skilled in this kind of terrain. They pushed the Germans back slowly but surely. The last German soldiers left Finnish soil in April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. The war left Lapland devastated. Over 100,000 people lost their homes. The cost of rebuilding was immense. The Lapland War is a perfect example of the shifting alliances and cruel ironies of the Second World War. Soldiers who had been brothers in arms were suddenly forced to kill each other. A country that had just survived 2 brutal wars had to fight a third one on its own soil against a former friend. It's a sad and bitter postscript to Finland's wartime experience. How much did the Finnish High Command know about the German scorched earth plans beforehand? What secret agreements existed between the Finnish and German officers on the ground to minimize casualties during the phony part of the war? And what was the true human cost for the indigenous Sami people of Lapland, whose homeland was turned into a battlefield? Number 10, what if the key to Europe was a flooded, muddy estuary? In the fall of 1944, the Allies were advancing across Europe. Paris had been liberated. The German army was in retreat. But there was a problem. A huge problem. The Allied armies, numbering in the millions, needed supplies. They needed fuel, ammunition, food, and they needed a port. The main ports in France, like Cherbourg, were either destroyed or too far from the front lines. The perfect port was Antwerp in Belgium. It was one of the largest ports in the world, and it was captured almost intact in early September 1944. The problem was you couldn't get to Antwerp from the sea. The port is located 50 miles inland on the Scheldt River. To get to it, ships had to sail through a long, wide estuary, and the German army still controlled the banks of that estuary. They held fortified positions on both sides. They controlled the islands in the middle. They had laid mines in the river. So the Allies had a port they couldn't use. While the port sat empty, the supply situation for the Allied armies grew desperate. The advance stalled. The war could not be won without opening Antwerp. The task of clearing the Scheldt was given mainly to the 1st Canadian Army. This force also included British, Polish, and other Allied units. The battle that followed the Battle of the Scheldt is one of the most overlooked major battles of the war. It was fought in October and November 1944. The conditions were appalling. The Germans had flooded much of the low-lying land. The Canadians had to attack across open, waterlogged fields. They fought in mud and rain. It was like the worst fighting of the First World War. The battle was really 4 separate operations. The Canadians had to clear the area north of Antwerp. They had to seal off the South Beveland Peninsula. They had to capture the island of Walcheren, which was a fortress. The fighting for a causeway connecting South Beveland to Walcheren was particularly grim. The causeway was a narrow, exposed strip of land, and the Canadians had to advance straight into heavy fire. The battle is well documented in C.P. Stacey's official history of the Canadian Army. He describes the incredible difficulty and the heavy cost. The final assault on Walcheren Island was a combined operation. Bombers breached the seawalls, flooding the island and isolating the German defenders. Then British commandos and Canadian infantry landed from the sea and across the causeway. By early November, the battle was over. The Scheldt was cleared of mines. The first supply ships reached Antwerp on November 28th. The logistical crisis was solved. The final push into Germany could begin, but the victory came at a high price. The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 12,000 casualties. The battle was overshadowed by the more glamorous but failed Operation Market Garden, which had happened just before. But many historians like Anthony Beaver argue that the Battle of the Scheldt was far more important. Without it, the war in Europe might have lasted much longer. It was a dirty, grinding, essential battle that has never gotten the attention it deserves. Why was the decision made to prioritize Operation Market Garden over clearing the Scheldt in September? How much faster could the war have ended if Antwerp had been opened a month earlier? And what role did the local Dutch resistance play in providing intelligence to the Canadian forces during the battle? The records are still incomplete. Number 9, did the war have a front in the Horn of Africa? Yes, it did, and it was one of the first places where the Allies won a major land campaign, the East African Campaign. The East African Campaign fought from 1941. It was a conflict fought over a vast area, from the deserts of Sudan to the mountains of Ethiopia. It involved a diverse cast of soldiers: British, South African, Indian, Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Ethiopian patriots. They were fighting the forces of fascist Italy, which had a large colonial empire in East Africa. In 1936, Italy had conquered Ethiopia, an ancient independent kingdom. The Italian leader dreamed of creating a new Roman Empire. His East African territories included Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, it had a huge army in the region, around 290,000 men. The British forces were heavily outnumbered. At first, the Italians had success. They captured British Somaliland and made small gains in Sudan and Kenya, but their commander, the Duke of Aosta, was cautious. He didn't press his advantage. The British, under General Archibald Wavell in Cairo, planned a counterattack. It was a bold, multi-pronged strategy. One force, under General William Platt, would attack from Sudan into Eritrea. Another force, under General Alan Cunningham, would attack from Kenya into Italian Somaliland and then north into Ethiopia. A third element was crucial, supporting the Ethiopian resistance. The exiled Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie returned to the region. With the help of a British officer named Orde Wingate, who would later become famous for leading the Chindits in Burma, he organized and led the Ethiopian Patriot Forces known as the Arbanyak. The British offensive began in early 1941. It was surprisingly successful. Cunningham's force, made up of South African, African, and Indian troops, advanced rapidly. They used motorized columns to sweep across the desert. They captured Mogadishu and then Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, in April 1941. In the north, Platt's force faced tougher resistance. The Italians were well defended in the mountains of Eritrea. The Battle of Keren was a long, hard-fought struggle. The Indian and British troops had to make repeated attacks against strongly fortified positions. But they finally broke through. With the main Italian armies defeated, the last pockets of resistance were mopped up. The final surrender came at Amba Alagi in May 1941, though some garrisons held out until November. The campaign was a stunning victory for the Allies. They had defeated a much larger army in a difficult environment. It was the first major Allied success on land. It boosted morale at a time when Britain was fighting alone. A.J. Barker's book, Eritrea 1941, gives a detailed account of the brutal fighting at Keren. The campaign had major consequences. It restored Ethiopia's independence. It removed the Italian threat to the Red Sea, a vital supply route to Egypt. It freed up British and Commonwealth troops for the war in North Africa. But today, few people remember it. It is overshadowed by the more famous desert battles against the Germans. But the East African campaign was a masterpiece of strategy and a testament to the diverse coalition of soldiers who fought for the Allied cause. What if the Duke of Aosta had been more aggressive in 1940? Could he have captured Khartoum or even threatened the Suez Canal? How important was Orde Wingate's role in organizing the Ethiopian resistance? And was he truly the military genius some claim? Finally, what happened to the thousands of local soldiers who fought for the Italians? Their stories are almost completely lost to history. Number 8. Why did Britain invade a French colony off the coast of Africa? The island of Madagascar is the fourth largest island in the world. During the Second World War, it was a French colony. After the fall of France in 1940, it was controlled by the Vichy French government, and that made the Allies very nervous. Why? Geography. Madagascar sits in a strategic position in the Indian Ocean. It lies across the main sea routes from the Cape of Good Hope to India, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union via Iran. The British were worried that Japan, which had entered the war in December 1941, might try to use Madagascar as a naval base. The fear was not unfounded. Japanese submarines were already operating in the Indian Ocean. A Japanese submarine base in Madagascar would be a disaster for the Allies. They could wreak havoc on the supply lines that were keeping the war effort going. The British Royal Navy was stretched thin. They couldn't afford this new threat. So in early 1942, Winston Churchill's government made a decision. They had to take Madagascar. The operation was codenamed Operation Ironclad. The invasion began on May 5th, 1942. It was primarily a British operation with naval, land, and air forces. They targeted the port of Diego Suarez at the northern tip of the island. The landings were successful, but the Vichy French defenders put up a surprisingly stiff fight. They were commanded by Governor General Armand Donnet, a staunch loyalist to the Vichy regime. He had been ordered to defend the island to the last. The fighting for Diego Suarez lasted for 3 days. After capturing the port, the British hoped the governor would surrender the whole island. He refused. For the next few months, there was a stalemate. The British held Diego Suarez, and the Vichy French held the rest of the vast island. But the threat of Japanese intervention was still there. In fact, just a few weeks after the invasion, Japanese midget submarines launched from a larger submarine offshore managed to enter Diego Suarez harbor. They damaged a British battleship and sank a tanker. This proved the British fears were justified. In September 1942, the British decided they had to conquer the entire island. They launched a new series of amphibious landings along the west coast. The campaign that followed was a strange one. It was a war of movement over huge distances with relatively small forces. The British had to advance down the length of the island to capture the capital, Antananarivo. The Vichy forces fought a series of delaying actions. The campaign is notable for the challenges of logistics and terrain. Madagascar had few roads, and the British had to contend with the island's difficult geography. Historian Eric Nadeville has studied the local impact of the campaign, noting the confusion and disruption it caused for the Malagasy people. The capital fell in late September. The governor finally surrendered in November 1942. The campaign had lasted for 6 months. It was a success for the Allies. They had secured a vital strategic location. But it was another one of those awkward campaigns where allies fought a former ally. After the campaign, control of the island was handed over to the Free French. The Battle of Madagascar is a footnote in most histories of the war. But it shows how the conflict reached even the most remote corners of the globe, and how strategic fears could lead to preemptive invasions. What if the Japanese had tried to establish a major base on Madagascar before the British invasion? How would that have changed the war in the Indian Ocean? How much did the local Malagasy population really understand about the global conflict that had landed on their shores? And were there any secret communications between the Vichy French on the island and the Japanese Navy that have not yet come to light? Number 7. How was the world's biggest country supplied? The war on the Eastern Front was a battle of numbers. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks and planes. The Soviet Union's ability to withstand the German invasion and eventually push back depended on its massive industrial production. But it also depended on help from its allies, Britain and the United States. This help came in the form of the Lend-Lease program. But getting those supplies to the Soviet Union was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. There were 3 main routes through Iran, across the Pacific to Vladivostok, and the most famous and deadliest of all, the Arctic convoys. These were convoys of merchant ships that sailed from the United Kingdom and Iceland to the northern Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The journey was a nightmare. It took them through the Arctic Ocean, some of the most treacherous waters in the world. In the winter, they faced darkness, freezing temperatures, and giant waves. Ice could form on the ships, making them top-heavy and unstable. In the summer, they faced the opposite problem, 24-hour daylight, which meant there was no night to hide from the enemy. And the enemy was always there. The convoys had to sail past German-occupied Norway. From bases there, German aircraft, U-boats, and surface ships could attack them. The journey was a running battle. The sailors on the merchant ships were civilians, but they faced military risks. They were protected by a small escort of Royal Navy warships. The men on these escorts were pushed to the limits of endurance, fighting off attacks in sub-zero temperatures. The story of these convoys is one of incredible bravery and hardship. The historian Richard Woodman, in his book Arctic Convoys 1941 to 1945, provides a definitive and harrowing account of these voyages. One of the most tragic events was the story of convoy PQ-17 in July 1942. The convoy consisted of 35 merchant ships. The British Admiralty received intelligence that major German warships, including a powerful battleship, were about to attack. Fearing a naval disaster, they made a controversial decision. They ordered the naval escort to withdraw and the convoy to scatter. Each merchant ship was to try to make it to Russia on its own. It was a death sentence. Without protection, the scattered ships were picked off one by German planes and U-boats. Only 11 of the 35 ships made it. It was a catastrophic failure. Despite the losses, the convoys continued. From 1941 to 1945, there were 78 convoys. They delivered over 4 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union. This included thousands of aircraft, tanks, and vehicles, as well as vital raw materials and food. This aid was crucial. While the Soviets produced most of their own weapons, the Lend-Lease supplies, especially things like trucks, jeeps, and railway equipment, gave the Red Army the mobility it needed to defeat the German army. The radios helped with command and control. The high-quality aluminum helped build planes. The men of the Arctic convoys were not recognized for their bravery for a long time. They were civilians, so they weren't given military medals. It was only decades after the war that their contribution was formally honored. Theirs was a cold, brutal, and vital front in the war. They didn't win any famous land battles, but without their sacrifice, the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front could have been very different. How decisive was the Lend-Lease aid? Could the Soviet Union have prevailed without it? What was the psychological impact on the sailors who survived disasters like PQ-17 and had to sail again, and what secret intelligence or false intelligence led to the disastrous decision to scatter that specific convoy. Number 6, could a coup in the Middle East have changed the war? In the spring of 1941, the situation in the Middle East was tense. Britain was fighting for its life in North Africa. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the British Empire, and Iraq, a supposedly independent country but one heavily under British influence, was about to explode. Iraq was a major oil producer, and its oil fields were vital to the Allied war effort. A pro-British government was in power. But there was a powerful group of pro-German Arab nationalists in the Iraqi army known as the Golden Square. They were led by a politician named Rashid Ali al-Gailani. In April 1941, Rashid Ali and the Golden Square launched a coup. They overthrew the pro-British government and seized power. They immediately began to make contact with the Axis powers. They wanted to end British influence in Iraq for good. For Britain, this was a crisis. A hostile Iraq, allied with the German regime, would be a disaster. It would threaten the oil supplies and put a pro-Axis government right on the doorstep of the Middle East. Churchill's government decided it had to act, and act quickly. This led to the short, sharp, and largely forgotten Anglo-Iraqi War. Britain had a treaty with Iraq that allowed it to station troops at bases in the country. They began to fly in reinforcements to the large air base at Habania, west of Baghdad. The new Iraqi government saw this as a threat. They surrounded the airbase with a large Iraqi army force, including artillery and armored cars. They demanded that all flights stop. The commander at Habania, Air Vice Marshal Harry Smart, was in a tough spot. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he decided the best defense was a good offense. On May 2nd, 1941, he launched a preemptive strike. The trainers and bombers at Habania, some of them very old, attacked the Iraqi forces surrounding the base. It was a huge gamble, but it worked. The Iraqi army was taken by surprise. The Royal Air Force Base, with a mix of pilots, trainees, and ground crew, held off the siege. Meanwhile, the British put together a relief column. It was a small, ad hoc force called Hab Force, commanded by Major General J.G.W. Clark. It set out from Palestine on an incredible journey across the desert to relieve Habaniya. The story is detailed in Robert Lyman's book, Iraq 1941. The German regime tried to help the Iraqis. They sent aircraft to Iraq via Syria, which was controlled by Vichy France. There were even some air battles between the RAF and the German Luftwaffe over the Iraqi desert, but the German help was too little, too late. Hab Force reached Habaniya. The Iraqi forces were defeated. By the end of May, British forces were entering Baghdad. Rashid Ali and his supporters fled the country. The pro-British government was restored. The war had lasted less than a month. The Anglo-Iraqi War was a small conflict, but its strategic importance was huge. It secured the vital oil supplies. It prevented the Axis powers from gaining a foothold in the Middle East. It was a bold and decisive action taken at a time when Britain was under immense pressure on other fronts. It's a classic example of a small war that had a big impact on the larger conflict. What if the Iraqi army had successfully captured the Habaniya airbase at the start of the conflict? How much more support was the German regime prepared to give Rashid Ali, and what long-term effects did this British intervention have on Iraqi politics and the rise of Arab nationalism in the decades that followed? Number 5, how did the biggest front of the war become a footnote? When we think of the Second World War, we often think of it starting in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. But for millions of people in Asia, the war started much earlier. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. This conflict, the Second Sino-Japanese War, would merge with the wider World War in 1941. It was a massive, brutal conflict that lasted for 8 years. It was, in terms of the number of people involved and the scale of the suffering, arguably the largest front of the entire war. Yet in the West, it is often treated as a sideshow. The war in China was fought on an epic scale. The Japanese army was modern and well-equipped. They quickly captured major cities like Shanghai and the capital, Nanjing. But China, under its leader Chiang Kai-shek, refused to surrender. The nationalist government retreated deep into the interior to the city of Chongqing. From there, they continued the fight. The war became a stalemate. Japan controlled the cities and the railway lines. The Chinese government controlled the vast countryside. It was a war of attrition. China fought alone for 4 years. The international community offered sympathy, but little real help. The Soviet Union provided some aid. A group of American volunteer pilots, the famous Flying Tigers, led by Claire Lee Chennault, fought for China. But for the most part, China was on its own. The human cost was staggering. Historians like Rana Mitter, in his book Forgotten Allied China's World War II, 1937 to 1945, argue that Western history has failed to acknowledge China's contribution. He estimates that millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians died. The war involved huge battles with hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side that are barely known in the West. There are battles like the defense of Shanghai, the Battle of Wuhan, or the Battle of Changsha. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, China officially became one of the Allies. The United States began to provide more aid. The American General Joseph Stilwell was sent to China to serve as Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. Their relationship was notoriously difficult. Stilwell wanted to reform the Chinese army. Chiang was suspicious of American intentions. The politics of the China front were incredibly complex. There was not just the war against Japan. There was also the internal struggle between Chiang's nationalists and the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. They had a temporary alliance to fight the Japanese, but they were also fighting for the future of China. The China front tied down a huge number of Japanese troops. For most of the war, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers were stationed in China. These were troops that could not be used in the Pacific against the Americans or in Burma against the British. By simply refusing to surrender, China made a massive contribution to the Allied victory. They bled the Japanese army dry year after year. It was a long, painful, and costly struggle, but it was a vital part of the global war. To forget the war in China is to misunderstand the Second World War itself. Why has the West been so slow to recognize the scale and importance of China's contribution to the war? How much did the internal conflict between the nationalists and communists affect the war effort against Japan? And if Japan had not invaded China in 1937, how might the entire course of the Second World War have been different? Number 4, did a small country's defiance expose a crack in the Axis? In October 1940, the war in Europe seemed to be going one way. The German army had swept across Western Europe. Britain was fighting alone. Then Italy's leader decided to expand the war. He issued an ultimatum to Greece. He demanded that Italian troops be allowed to occupy strategic locations in the country. The Greek Prime Minister, Ioannis Metaxas, gave a simple one-word reply, hui, no. On October 28, 1940, Italian forces invaded Greece from Albania, which they already occupied. The Italian leader expected an easy victory. He thought the Greek army would collapse in a few days. He was wrong. The Greek-Italian war turned into a humiliation for Italy. The Greek army was small and not well equipped, but they were fighting for their homeland, and they were fighting in mountains they knew well. They stopped the Italian invasion cold, then they launched a counteroffensive. They pushed the Italian army back deep into Albania. It was the first major land victory for any Allied country in the war. The world was stunned. The tiny Greek army was defeating one of the major Axis powers. The victory was a huge boost to morale for the Allies. It showed that the Axis was not invincible. The Greek soldiers, the Evzones, became heroes. Their commander, General Alexandros Papagos, managed the campaign brilliantly. The success was due to high morale, tough soldiers, and a clever use of the mountainous terrain, which negated the Italian advantage in tanks and vehicles. His books on the Balkan campaigns, such as John Keegan's The Second World War, highlight this as a critical moment. It was a David and Goliath story, but the Greek victory had a fateful consequence. The German government in Berlin was embarrassed by its allies' failure. More importantly, they were worried The British were starting to send aid and air support to Greece. The Germans feared that Greece could become a British base, a Balkan front that could threaten their southern flank and the vital Romanian oil fields. The German leadership decided they had to intervene. In April 1941, German forces, along with Bulgarian and Hungarian allies, invaded Greece and Yugoslavia. The German invasion was swift and overwhelming. The small Greek army, exhausted from 6 months of fighting the Italians, was no match for the German armored divisions. The British sent an expeditionary force to help, but it was too little, too late. By the end of April, mainland Greece was occupied. The war then moved to the island of Crete, where the Allies made a last stand in another famous but ultimately failed battle. The Greek-Italian War is often seen as just a prelude to the German invasion of the Balkans. But it was important in its own right. Greece's defiance gave the world a much-needed story of hope, and it had a major strategic impact. The German invasion of Greece and the Balkans delayed their planned invasion of the Soviet Union by several crucial weeks. Some historians argue that this delay was fatal. It meant the German army reached the gates of Moscow just as the brutal Russian winter set in. It is one of the great what-ifs of the war. It all started with a small nation's courageous no. Did the Italian failure in Greece fundamentally weaken the Axis partnership? How crucial was the delay caused by the Balkan campaign to the outcome on the Eastern Front? And what if Britain had sent a much larger expeditionary force to Greece in early 1941? Could the German invasion have been stopped? Number 3, what if a resistance movement became a regular army? During the Second World War, every occupied country had a resistance movement, but none was as large, as organized, or as successful as the one in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav partisans were more than just a guerrilla force. They were a full-fledged army. At their peak, they numbered over 800,000 men and women. They tied down hundreds of thousands of German, Italian, and collaborationist troops. They liberated large areas of their own country. They were, without a doubt, the most effective resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. Yugoslavia was invaded and dismembered by the Axis powers in April 1941. Two main resistance groups emerged. The Chetniks were Serbian nationalists, loyal to the exiled royal government. The Partisans were a communist-led, multi-ethnic force led by the charismatic Josip Broz, better known as Tito. At first, the two groups tried to cooperate, but they had very different goals. The Chetniks wanted to wait for an Allied invasion. Tito's partisans believed in constant, aggressive action. Soon they were fighting not only the occupiers, but also each other in a brutal civil war. Tito was a brilliant organizer and strategist. He built the partisan movement from a small group of militants into a disciplined army. They waged a relentless guerrilla war. They blew up bridges, sabotaged railway lines, and ambushed enemy patrols. The German and Italian forces responded with a series of major anti-partisan offensives. These were huge operations designed to encircle and destroy the partisan main force. The most famous of these were the Battle of the Neretva and the Battle of the Suceska in 1943. The partisans, accompanied by their wounded, were surrounded. They suffered terrible losses, but managed to break out each time. These battles are legendary in the history of the former Yugoslavia and are detailed in works like Fitzroy Maclean's memoir, Eastern Approaches. Maclean was a British officer sent to liaise with Tito. At first, the Allies supported the Chetniks, but they grew frustrated with their lack of action and evidence of their collaboration with the Italians. Maclean's reports from the ground were crucial. He convinced Churchill that the partisans were the only group seriously fighting the Axis. In 1943, the Allies switched their support to Tito. They began to supply the partisans with weapons, equipment, and air support. The partisans formed proletarian brigades and divisions. They had their own air force and navy. They were becoming a regular army. By 1944, the partisans were strong enough to engage in conventional warfare. They liberated Belgrade in October 1944 with some help from the advancing Red Army. But unlike in other Eastern European countries, the Yugoslavs liberated most of their own country. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Tito was in control of Yugoslavia. He had won not only a war of liberation, but also a civil war. This is why after the war, Yugoslavia was able to follow its own path, independent of the Soviet Union. The partisan struggle was an epic of resilience and determination. They fought against overwhelming odds. They proved that a well-organized and motivated popular movement could take on and defeat a modern, industrialized army. It was a unique phenomenon in the Second World War. What would have happened if the Allies had continued to back the Chetniks instead of Tito? How did the partisans manage to create such a disciplined and effective army with so few resources in the beginning? And how many of the internal conflicts and rivalries from that era are still unresolved in the politics of the Balkan region today? Number 2, how did a race across a frozen lake decide a nation's fate? It was the winter of 1939. The world was focused on the phony war in the West, but in the North, a very real war was raging. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland. The conflict became known as the Winter War. On paper, it was a total mismatch. The Soviet Red Army was one of the largest in the world. They had thousands of tanks and planes. Finland was a small nation with a tiny army. They had very few tanks, almost no modern aircraft, and a shortage of everything, especially anti-tank weapons. Everyone expected Finland to be crushed in a matter of weeks. But the Finns had a few things on their side. They were defending their homes. They had incredible courage, or sis, as they call it. And they were masters of winter warfare. The Soviet invasion plan was to cut Finland in half by advancing across its narrow waist to the Gulf of Bothnia. The Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions were tasked with this. They advanced along a road near the village of Suomussalmi. And there they ran into a Finnish buzzsaw. The Finnish forces were outnumbered, but they used their environment perfectly. They moved on skis through the dense forest, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They were dressed in white camouflage. The Soviets were stuck on the roads in their long, vulnerable columns of tanks and trucks. The Finns used a tactic they called mati. It means a pile of logs waiting to be chopped. They would cut the road in front of and behind a section of the Soviet column, trapping them in pockets or matas. Then they would attack these isolated pockets from all sides, day and night, in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The Battle of Suomussalmi was a military masterpiece. Under the command of Colonel Halmar Silasvuo, the small Finnish 9th Division first destroyed the 163rd Division. Then they turned their attention to the elite 44th Motorized Division, which had been sent to relieve them. The battle for the Rot Road is legendary. The Finns annihilated the entire division. The road was left as a grim monument littered with thousands of frozen bodies and hundreds of burned-out tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. The Finns captured enough equipment to supply several divisions. The victory at Suomussalmi was a huge shock to the world. It showed that the mighty Red Army was not invincible. It was a textbook example of how a smaller, smarter force can defeat a larger, more cumbersome one. The story is told in books like William R. Trotter's A Frozen Hell, the Russo-Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940. But despite their heroic resistance and stunning victories like Suomussalmi, the Finns could not win the war. The Soviets learned from their mistakes. They brought in massive reinforcements and a new commander, Semyon Timoshenko. They finally broke through the main Finnish defense line, the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus. In March 1940, after 105 days of fighting, Finland was forced to sign a peace treaty. They lost a significant amount of territory. But they had saved their independence. They had shown the world what a small nation could do when pushed to the wall. The Winter War was a short, brutal conflict, but its lessons about tactics, morale, and the dangers of underestimating an opponent echoed throughout the rest of the Second World War. How did the Red Army, which performed so poorly in Finland, transform into the force that would later defeat the German army? What if France and Britain had gone through with their plans to send an expeditionary force to help Finland, potentially starting a war with the Soviet Union? And what specific intelligence failures led the Soviet leadership to so badly misjudge the Finnish will to resist? Number one was the first battle, the one that mattered most. We often think the war was won in the great grinding battles of 1943, 1944, and 1945. But what if the fate of the world was decided much earlier? In the first 2 years of the war, Britain stood alone against, a dominant Axis Europe, its survival depended on one thing: control of the sea. And Britain is an island. It had to import food to feed its people and raw materials to fuel its war industries. These all came by ship, mostly from North America. The German Navy's primary goal was to cut this lifeline. The struggle to keep the sea lanes open was called the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war, running from the first day in 1939 to the last day in 1945. Winston Churchill said that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one thing that truly frightened him during the war. It was a war of technology, intelligence, and endurance. The main weapon was the German U-boat. These submarines, often operating in groups called wolf packs, hunted the Allied convoys. In the early years of the war, they were devastatingly successful. A period in 1940 to 41 was known to the U-boat crews as the happy time. They sank ships faster than the Allies could build them. Britain was slowly being strangled. The battle was fought in the vast, empty expanses of the Atlantic. It was a cold, impersonal kind of war. A ship would be there 1 minute, and then a torpedo would hit, and it would be gone the next. The sailors on the merchant ships and the naval escorts lived with constant tension, but the Allies fought back. They developed new technologies. Radar helped them detect U-boats on the surface at night. High-frequency direction finding, or HUF-DUF, could pinpoint a U-boat's location when it transmitted a radio message. Sonar, or ASDIC as the British called it, could detect submerged submarines. They also developed new weapons, like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing depth charge. The most important weapon, however, may have been intelligence. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain had a major breakthrough. They managed to crack the complex Enigma codes used by the German Navy. This was a war-winning achievement. It allowed the Allies to reroute their convoys around the U-boat wolf packs. It was a secret so vital that it was kept hidden for decades after the war. The story is told in books like Seizing the Enigma by David Kahn. The turning point in the battle came in the spring of 1943. In May of that year, which became known as Black May for the German U-boat arm, the Allies sank a huge number of U-boats for relatively few merchant ship losses. The combination of better technology, more escort ships, long-range aircraft that could cover the mid-Atlantic gap, and the Enigma intelligence finally tipped the balance. The U-boat wolf packs were withdrawn from the North Atlantic. They would continue to be a threat for the rest of the war, but they were never again able to threaten Britain's survival. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single event, but a long, grueling campaign of attrition. The men who fought it on the merchant ships and the warships were some of the unsung heroes of the war. They didn't win fame or glory, but without their victory, there would have been no D-Day. There would have been no liberation of Europe. Britain would have been starved into submission. It was the foundational victory upon which all other Allied victories in the West were built. What if the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had failed to crack the naval Enigma code? Could the Allies have still won the Battle of the Atlantic through technology alone? How close did Britain really come to starvation and collapse in 1941 and 1942? And what undiscovered U-boat wrecks at the bottom of the Atlantic still hold secrets about the technological race that defined this silent, brutal campaign?